Okay, so I think we had an excellent stage setter, and the ministers really, I think, set the bar high in terms of speaking frankly and openly, and I hope that this panel will continue this tradition. Euro-Atlantic and European security are, of course, indivisible, but this panel will venture forward in exploring how Europe can position itself in terms of technology, economic power, and military readiness to withstand the challenges to come. And in this panel, we have excellent perspectives from Estonia, France, Britain, and Austria, and a wonderful moderator, Wojciech Żybilski, editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight and president of the Respublika Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's allow a couple of seconds because people are joining. Take your seats comfortably. This discussion is under quite a provocative title myself, in my opinion. Under whose umbrella? That's not really a question. The future of dilemmas of European security. But let's continue. And I wonder what you have to say. We have a panel of excellent speakers with us. Jonatan Vseviov is the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia. Philippe Errera, Executive Vice President for the International Public Affairs at Safran Group. Shashank Joshi, the Economist defense editor, and Galina Chakarova, global geopolitical strategist. So I couldn't be more happy to pick this title apart and ask you to demolish the question that is asked at the very beginning. It doesn't seem that there we have any choice of various umbrellas, but also feel free to disagree with me. We'll start with some opening remarks by our guest speakers, and then we'll proceed to a discussion. I will encourage all of you in the audience to be as engaged in asking questions and giving comments in the second part of the panel as you were in the first two panels, which were so excellent and interesting. But now I wanted to paint a bit of a picture while you're also getting seated in the room and give the floor to our speakers. So we're in 50 years maybe after the Helsinki Accords and Helsinki Conference that set some parameters of a security system in Europe, and we also know, and we can disagree on since when we know that, that there is no security of that sort in Europe, primarily because its key actor, member of the agreements, disagrees with these agreements and does not honor them anymore. There is a big question about the outcome of the Ukrainian struggle. We have both the material question, but also the moral question, the willingness question, both in our societies and also in many other societies as it comes to the struggle. We have numerous and increasing number of challenges that are also material to Europe. In a way, you could say that we have been living the prosperous and secure Europe for the past 30 years with cheap US security, cheap Russian energy, and cheap Chinese labor. None of that is true anymore, nothing that is cheap, at least. And then we have this potentially pivotal moment in European project history where there's at least a push to do something about it. With this array of various questions, I'll hand over to Jonatan Vseviov to ask what outcomes of the war may bring to the security of Europe.
Thank you, and first of all, thank you very much for having me here to represent the cool and calm Estonian view with total lack of emotion. So please pardon me already for lacking totally in emotion and being extremely blunt in my answer to the question. A few points I want to make. First of all, this war that Russia has unleashed is of existential importance. Existential importance. Not because of geographic proximity of the fighting, but because of those core principles and norms that you alluded to, core principles of European security, that whether we want it or not will be shaped by the outcome of the war. And once the dust of war settles and we'll have peace again, we'll either have territorial integrity as the remaining cornerstone of international life here in Europe, or we will go back to an era where great powers can change their smaller neighbors' borders with force. And if that turns out to be the case, then show me on the map of Europe a border that remains secure. Certainly not ours. Secondly, we'll either have sovereignty as the remaining cornerstone of international life here in Europe, or we will go back to an era where great powers divided up continents between them. And we Europeans know not to play with that Pandora's box again. Aggression as a tool of statecraft will either be discredited again, with the aggressor finding himself in a worse position than when he started this, or we will open this Pandora's box with repercussions not only for European but global security. So absolutely existential. Now, 3 points I want to make. I want to attack 3 notions that seem to gain in popularity, certainly in the European debate. First, the peace narrative. Whenever we talk about the need to support Ukraine with military assistance, we have some people raising up and saying that, no, we should want peace, as if we did not want peace. We obviously do, as if the Ukrainians didn't want peace. What an absurd notion to promote. Obviously they do. And as if it was even in question whether there would be peace. Obviously there will be peace. All wars end. This war too will end. It will end with peace. Now, what kind of peace we'll have will depend on how this war ends. We either manage to push Russia to change its goals, or we allow Russia to push us to change ours. Now, we've, as Estonia, constantly argued that what we want is a just and lasting peace, and that means 3 things. A just and lasting peace that stands on the principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty, on the notion that aggression as a tool of statecraft needs to be discredited, and when it comes to European security, then the construct that stands on the 2 feet of NATO and the European Union. Now, some have argued that our goals are too maximalist. They're not. They're not. All we want is for Russia to pull itself back into Russia, into its internationally recognized borders, and stay there. If this is a maximalist goal, I challenge you to define a realistic one. Mind you, attempts to buy oneself stability by feeding the aggressor the freedom of others will lead to nothing but catastrophe. As before in the 20th century, so too in the 21st. Third notion I'd like to attack is this narrative of tiredness. We're tiring. The Ukrainians are tiring. European public opinion is tiring. That's an absurd notion. It rests on the assumption that if we were to be able to somehow conclude this war, that we would also be able, by definition, to take a break, go back to the supposed era of peace and stability. That's not how history works. We never go back. We always go forward. Look at the best case scenario. We succeed. Territorial integrity, sovereignty restored. Aggression as a tool of statecraft discredited. The maximalist goal of Estonia's is achieved. And yet, the list of challenges that confront Europe remain the same. We're still going to have to win the peace in Ukraine. We're still going to have to manage relations with Russia. The Middle East is still going to be on fire. Africa, with all of its potential, is also going to be a source of potential danger. New global powers are rising that we need to manage. Global challenges like international terrorism or climate change, all of it. There is not going to be a time where we as Europeans can take a time off again. The only choice we have is whether we go and face those challenges after having succeeded in defending the core principles of European security in our backyard, or after having failed. The list of challenges is going to be the same. My suggestion would be to succeed. No reason why we shouldn't be able to do that. 440 million Europeans, amongst the richest people in the world, together with our transatlantic allies, 1 billion people. And we're in a struggle for our future with a country that Senator John McCain famously described as nothing but a gas station with nukes. We can do it. We can do it. But it's not going to mean that we'll be able to take a time off. Finally, on the umbrella. Now, the umbrella question obviously refers to the upcoming American presidential elections. What would happen? We're here in Latvia, one of the most transatlantic of European countries. I represent one of the most transatlantic of European countries. So we're obviously watching American elections with keen interest. We're very interested in maintaining a strong transatlantic relationship. And many in Estonia and around Europe are concerned that perhaps the Americans might leave us. Now, what I want to say about this is, paradoxically, the things we need to do to convince the US to stay are the very same things we would have to do if the US were to leave. Invest in our own defense, speak as Europeans with one voice, and stand on our 2 feet, and conduct foreign policy, not as an art of issuing statements, but as a truly strategic affair, bringing together the different levers of our power, from trade to development assistance to diplomacy. Now, when I look at the new team that's coming in Brussels, I have every reason to believe that we'll be able to do that. But stand on our 2 feet, we Europeans absolutely must.
Let's come back to
our own umbrella is the answer. Whose umbrella? European umbrella.
Thank you very much. Let's come back to these points also on what Europe can do collectively in a moment. Also with the new leadership coming from this region, exclusively, or not exclusively, but predominantly focused on foreign policy and geopolitical topics related to the new Commission. But Mr. Errera, I wanted to ask about your assessment of whether and to what extent Europe can provide the elements of security in our own defense, be it industry, be it our defense posture, our society's commitment or willingness to commit. What's your take?
Thank you very much, and I'd also like to say how honored I am to be here, and what a pleasure it is to be with old friends. If I didn't know better, I would say that Jonatan spoke like a true Frenchman. If French diplomacy were as good as Estonian diplomacy.
You're going to get me fired.
Before coming to your question, which I will address, I'd just like to make a couple of points which I think are relatively simple and uncontroversial, but you never know, and I think it's important to know if we're on the same ground. First point, which is simple and may not be wholly uncontroversial, is that whoever is elected in Washington, D.C. on November 5th, the idea that the United States will remain as committed to Europe's security as it is today, I think is a fiction, and is a dangerous fiction. We like to think that the Trump mandate was a parenthesis. I personally think that the Biden mandate is a parenthesis in terms of having a U.S. administration as committed to Europe's security as the one that is the case today. And this is for a whole series of systemic reasons which will not go away, having to do with demography, having to do with the backlash after Iraq, and maybe to a lesser extent Afghanistan, having to do with the pivot to Asia, all sorts of things. This does not mean that we should seek to weaken this partnership, but that we need to be lucid and recognize that, as Jonatan said, the only true umbrella you can trust is the one that you have, the one you are holding. This does not mean that you don't want to look for other ones as a complement, but not as an alternative. Second point, which I think is important, is to also take the full measure of the intensity, of the breadth, and of the intertwining of the threats we are facing. Another way of saying this is it is absolutely vital that Russia fails in Ukraine, and that not only the security and the sovereignty of Ukraine is fully secured, but also that the principles that Jonatan mentioned, which are what this is about, are upheld. There's no doubt about this. But whatever the outcome of the war in Ukraine, the threats that we're facing as Europe will grow. Of course, they will be far more difficult to address if Putin is victorious in Ukraine, but the reverse isn't true. And I think if we don't realize that we will continue to face China that is increasingly revisionist and assertive, to not say aggressive, in its regional environment, and a regional environment that has no borders from the Chinese point of view. If we don't recognize that we will continue to have not just a Middle East on fire as if we were describing a natural phenomenon, but revisionist actors armed with everything they have invested in. And if you look at the Iranian missile capabilities, whether it be ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, the way they've grown over the last 10 years, and Iran inching toward a nuclear military capability, that is not going to disappear. We used to speak of Iranian missiles on European soil as wargaming scenarios. This is the case today. Cruise missiles today, perhaps ballistic missiles tomorrow. The fact that it's through and with Russia does not change anything in the equation. We're speaking of Chinese enablement of the Russian aggression. You can have sophisticated legal and to a certain extent diplomatic debates on is it lethal aid or not. I don't think it makes much of a difference if these are enablers in terms of targeting, in terms of equipment, in terms of sustainment, and this is not going to go away. And what I've just described are state threats and state challenges. We know, as Europeans, just looking as recently as the last 10 years, that either non-state actors used by states, look at Hezbollah terrorism against Europeans, including on European soil over the last decades, or fully non-state actors, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda-related groups, and the attacks that we had in Europe not that long ago. This has not gone away either, and so it's so it's not going to get better. It's a long way. It's a long way of saying what I was pointing out, what I was referring to initially. And if we're not able to recognize what it means in terms of our force posture and capabilities, and not simply be sitting on the pendulum that swings from capabilities needed for force projection in crisis management operations outside of our borders to territorial defense and back, but to recognize that we are going to increasingly need to be able to address all of them, and increasingly need to address all of them more and more on our own, then we risk always fighting the last battle. And the reason for which I say that it will not get better isn't some innate pessimism. It's simply that once you start eroding both the norms, the institutions, and the will or the capability of the enforcers, for lack of a better word, countries, in this case the United States, that for a very long time believed that there was a complete or a broad confluence between their national interest and the interest in upholding this system, including at the expense of blood and treasure, then every time that one actor breaks these norms and does not suffer consequences, it's an incentive for others to do so. Mm-hmm. All of this being said, and I'm sorry for being a little bit too long, in terms of our response, I think the first element which is indispensable is just the recognition, the will, and the resolve. And we can come back to this in the discussion question. It's not something that you decide at the snap of a finger. And it's increasingly challenging when our internal societal resilience is challenged by these outside actors and on purpose. Greater defense spending. There's been an increase over the last decade. It is too slow, and it is not where we should be collectively. Greater investment, I would say, in European defense industry. And I don't say this from a business point of view, because I work today for a company that is active in the European defense industrial base, but I say this from a strategic point of view. Because I think that more European money for European industry having the capability to produce more European equipment is the only long-term guarantee that this increased defense spending is sustained in political terms. If you are spending European taxpayers' money, then at some point in the system, you need to have it be for European jobs, European industry, and European R&D. I think that it's also the only long-term guarantee that we will be able to use our own equipment in ways that are strategically aligned with our operational goals. The debates that you have today on whether US equipment can be used to strike this or that target is just but one example. We know it in every operation in which we're engaged. You need to have the autonomy to make your decisions and then implement them. It's the only long-term guarantee of security of supply as well. Now, of course, first of all, there are short-term emergencies that require that you buy off-the-shelf non-European equipment. Of course, building up a European defense industrial base does not mean that we cannot or should not cooperate with our allies and partners who also have strong defense industries, but I think we should do it with those imperatives in mind. Final point, and I'll wrap up. I think that we cannot avoid having a comprehensive discussion on an issue that is politically sensitive in different European countries for different reasons, which is nuclear deterrence. First of all, of course, there is the question of the nuclear dimension of the war in Ukraine. But if you think of the threats and challenges we mentioned, including on European soil, coming from China, coming from North Korea, at some point coming from Iran, the nuclear dimension is certainly there from their point of view in terms of the way they think about the equation. And so we need to think about the US commitment to nuclear sharing within the alliance, to UK and French contributions to allied and European security with the nuclear deterrent in a way that I know is difficult, but that we cannot avoid. And we have to address head-on. Sorry.
Thank you. All very important points. We'll try to come back to those in a discussion. I think there is some room for follow-up. Thank you very much. Shashank, I will address you now with the questions that might be pivoting away from a very perspective we have here in Central Eastern Europe, which is the focus on Ukraine and Russia alone, and ask to what extent are we in a global struggle, how much that conflict, as we see, is already other powers' conflict. Because there are some allusions in the discussion here that there is some support, there is a position which seem ambivalent, maybe, if you want to be very diplomatic, or and I think it would be good to know your position on that. But also, I wanted to ask because you'll have your 5 minutes plus, but not too much plus. We have heard already in the panel how much we have been changing in the past, the defense spending, and there hasn't been enough. There has been a decreasing spending on defense, and now we are talking and slowly increasing defense spending. But that comes with the other problem, of course, how do we secure support for that spending also in Europe?
Thank you very much. let me try and avoid the plus and see if I can stick to 5 minutes. Just gesticulate at me if I cross it. Just 3 quick points, which I hope tackle all those things. First of all, to directly pick up, I agree with a huge proportion of what Jonathan and Philippe have said. The one reservation I have is your conclusion, Jonathan, which is our umbrella. Yes, in theory, yes in principle, yes, that's the aspiration. But I can't help but reflect on the fact that we've just come off a 3-4 month debate over the use of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles in Russian soil. And as Europeans, as France, as the UK, we've provided very high-end cruise missiles to Ukraine that have been used to fantastic effect to kill Russians and do great damage to the Black Sea Fleet and to Russian forces in Crimea. To my knowledge, not a single missile has landed inside Russia, and we are engaged in a situation where to use these missiles, certainly on the British side, to maximal effectiveness against the most complex, well-defended Russian targets, it appears to be that we're reliant on advanced American intelligence for mission planning and guidance in ways that have narrowed European choices. So if we're talking about our umbrella, European autonomy in these choices, on a matter as simple as that, the provision of weapons and the ability to use these weapons, we haven't really got autonomy in practice. And that's just one of many, many examples where the delta between what we would like to see and where we are is enormous. And I haven't seen it narrow, particularly over the last 2 years. So that worries me. We're in a period of institutional flux where we can see the doubts that are arising around the future of US leadership inside NATO, the integrity of the alliance in the very long run, its political coherence and sustainability. But we are in a period of real ferment as to what can take its place. Or what can even complement it, I think is the phrase that Philippe used. So, of course, the EU is becoming a serious defence and security player. We also see the Joint Expeditionary Force, Jeff, that was mentioned in the Foreign Minister's comments on the previous stage. We see bilateral and minilateral arrangements. But I think there's still no real answer to what happens if the worst comes to pass and we see a president undermine Article 5 or pull out of the alliance. We have this strategic cacophony of institutions, and we still have the serious problem of how we integrate non-EU military players into what is a burgeoning, more ambitious EU defence space. Philippe alluded to this, I think, but we have EU aspirations to say, is it 60% of defence spending should be within the bloc by 2035, is it? Someone will correct me, which raises profound questions for countries like Poland, Sweden, other countries that have significant defence industrial ties outside. We haven't answered those questions. Number 2, very briefly, nuclear weapons. I completely agree we're in a period where we have to think hard about the role that the UK and France can play in supplementing, reinforcing, adding to American deterrence, because we don't know for how long that will be there in the current form. The only thing I'd add to this is that we're speaking on a day in which President Zelensky, articulating his peace plan, talking to America, has talked about the idea that Ukrainian nuclear weapons would be the alternative to NATO membership. And that tells me a few things. It tells me that how difficult it is proving for him to extract serious, substantial security guarantees from the alliance. But it also tells us that existing norms around nuclear proliferation, the way we talk about nuclear weapons, that's changing. It's changing for lots of reasons. You see it in South Korea, you see it in the Middle East, but we also, I don't think, have fully realized we're seeing it in Europe, and we could see much more of it in Europe in the years ahead. We can talk more about that. The final point, and this, Wojciech, gets directly to your point about the global dimension of this. It struck me this week. You know, we spent a lot of time rightly thinking about the quartet of chaos, right? I think, as my colleagues called it, Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, and the deepening interlinkages between these countries. Of course, we haven't explicitly mentioned, we now have some more evidence. China is not just providing dual-use components to the Russians, they're providing platforms, finished platforms in the form of drones, and this is a real crossing of the Rubicon that we haven't really addressed fully. But on the other side, I also can't help but notice the fact that Australia this week announced the provision of 49 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. Doesn't seem like very much. You know, I know many countries in this region have provided significantly more armor from their old stockpiles, and that sometimes gets overlooked. But United States, if I'm not mistaken, Ben, maybe you'll correct me if you know the numbers, but I think it's 31 Abrams provided so far. I'm sure someone will correct me. So that's remarkable, I think, that not only do we have a situation in which an Asian country, South Korea, has provided a huge amount of firepower for the Ukrainians to enable their offensives in ways that put some Europeans to shame, but we have Australia stepping in to provide this enormous batch of armor to the Ukrainians. And what that tells us, I think, is that when we think about Europe's position in Asia, it's not just about what are we doing in the Taiwan Strait, what's our military presence in Asia. It's the fact that these emerging powers, these Asian countries, these middle powers in the Indo-Pacific, they are going to be exerting a profound influence on our region for good and for ill in the next 10 years. And it's got to be a really high priority of our diplomacy to build the ties necessary to shape those choices and to engage with them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's excellent. And also, again, many points to come back to. But speaking of the Chinese question in the struggle, in the European struggle today, both in the military front in Ukraine and the relation with China, with Russia, but also on a more substantial level, economic security level, Velina, we couldn't imagine to have a better speaker than yourself, who coined the dragon bear term in the policy debate.
Yeah, thank you. It's really great that my colleagues set the stage, and now I'm in a very convenient situation just to touch upon the points I find relevant for my, let's say, 5 minutes introduction. And I will start from the global arena, from the macro geopolitical perspective. Well, the dragon bear, this modus vivendi of coordination in all strategic domains between China and Russia has been in the making since 2014. It's just that the West in general, and even more so Europe, haven't been paying attention to. And even now, when I listen to the discussions, and I've been listening to the discussions very carefully for the last 2.5 years when it comes to China-Russia, well, it's too slow, and it's too convenient in a way that we still don't want to face the reality the way it is. Now, let me give you a few examples. On the 24th of February 2022, I said that one of the reasons, because the only thing that I got wrong about the war was I got the timing right, I got the international dimension of the war correctly, in a sense that I said that there will be a lot of countries and a lot of bad surprises for us here in Europe when it comes to support for Russia, not just diplomatic, but also economic. But the point, or let's say the sentence I got the most bashing about was actually that I said that Russia would have never launched all-in war against Ukraine if it had not relied on the comprehensive support by China. This was 24th of February 2022. Why are we wasting so much time in order to gather the facts, in order to gather observations, instead of actually working with hypotheses that will help us in a sense of precautionary principle? And I'm still missing that on all these 3 dimensions. So the global dimension, I haven't heard any single discussion, and I understand very well that politicians have to be politically correct, but even in our communities, the expert communities, in which kind of direction this world is sliding into. We don't want to say loudly the word Cold War 2.0. It's a Cold War 2.0, and Ukraine has been the first proxy war in a series of interconnected geopolitical hotspots. Meanwhile, we have 3 of them simultaneously happening, not just in Eastern Europe, but also in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific, namely in South China Sea. So we are afraid of actually facing the reality, even when it comes to narratives. We don't want to talk about Cold War 2.0. We don't want to talk about the dragon bear. That's even right now, 2024, actually a taboo topic, because we don't know the facts on the ground when it comes to defense cooperation, when it comes to the military-industrial coordination, complex of coordination between these 2 nations, how often they meet, how often actually their military officials are meeting, twice, probably up to 3 times per month. If you have followed last week's first meeting between the new defense minister of Russia and his Chinese counterpart, where they openly claim that deepening of military cooperation between Russia and China is meant to maintain global and regional security. I haven't heard a single comment coming from the West. Okay, our American friends are in an election cycle, but did you hear any comments about that here in Europe? So this is the macro perspective. Even if we would be wrong with the assessment of Cold War 2.0, let's say we prepare too much for it, we're still on the right side of history. Why? Because if the global order goes in the direction of, let's say, volatile multipolarity with more power centers, still we are better equipped than we are right now, 3 years in a war. Second important point on my side is when it comes to of course, the European perspective. Here I have more criticism than good news for you. And yes, I'm based in Vienna, but I'm actually staunch Eastern European. I was born also in the Soviet bloc, come from Bulgaria, so I do understand actually the frustration when for the last 25 years we've been saying, not just on Russia, but in general on many other approaches that we've developed collectively, that they will backfire, like Wandel durch Handel, like the approach of de-risking, which is going to backfire. I can guarantee you that the de-risking approach to China is going to backfire. And once again, we will be hearing how we were, from our politicians, how wrong they were and that they're sorry. Because, for instance, our Austrian president, he came publicly and he said that he's sorry that he got Putin wrong. Did this actually change anything for us? Did this improve our situation in general? No. It's not about who is wrong and who is right. It is actually about being correct this time in our assessment. So when it comes to the European dimension, again, where do I see the risks, the dilemmas? Because this is our topic. The dilemma here is how to prioritize between industry in general and boosting competitiveness. Think of all these plans and reports coming out right now. Think of the ambitious agenda of the new Commission and security and defense, because security and defense might be, put in the context of industry, but it's not just industry. So here I'm afraid that once again, those who want to put the emphasis on industry, competitiveness, creating jobs, this is now the mantra in Western Europe, is going to prevail over those here in Central Eastern Europe and in the Nordics that, of course, see existential security threats. They would like, first and foremost, to solve the security dilemma before actually solving the competitiveness dilemma. The same divisions within Europe, even though that we will not admit it, but think about it. Are we all on the same page when it comes to the strategic consensus, what our ultimate goal in this war is, as Europeans? Are we on the same page? Do we want the same for Ukraine and for us? And I say still, no, this is not the case. We do not have a strategic consensus when it comes to restoration of Ukraine's borders per 1991. It's so simple, the sentence is so simple, and yet politicians are struggling to claim it openly. Not all of them, of course. The same goes also for the division within Europe when it comes to the future of the transatlantic community. We have a division still invisible, but it's going to become more and more visible as the new Iron Curtain is going to emerge. And that is that in the Nordics and in Central Eastern Europe, we have staunch transatlanticists who put the emphasis on the United States, and that means American umbrella and not a European umbrella for the security. So to wrap it up, when we talk about umbrella, if we use the umbrella for the American security guarantees, then what are the European security and defense policy guarantees? A raincoat?
On that note, on that sentence, I have to say, with regret, we have only 15 minutes more into this discussion and debate, and there are so many questions I also want to ask, but I want to give you priority. So if I see raised hands, I'll just ask, is there a mic that you could use? There's a need of a mic there for... Yes, please introduce yourself and ask the question.
Hi, Anna Jovanovska, North Macedonia. Evelina, I'm so happy to see you, you know that. Given your analysis on the geopolitical, development, I would kindly ask you for your thoughts on potential solution in order to achieve peace when it comes to this Russian-Ukraine aggression. I would kindly, ask not to have this rhetoric of, the borders as per the Constitution and what was achieved in 1991. Let's be realistic. And let's, see what are the potential, let's say, solutions. I've read maybe around February.
Because of the time, could we just limit your intervention to a question, not comments?
The question, what are the potential solutions to achieve peace? I've read that there should be maybe also consideration about the Dayton model for these temporarily occupied territories. But what are your thoughts on it, given that you've predicted quite, strictly what was going to happen with that part of the world? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Evelina, that was yours.
Of course, my colleagues can also join the conversation, because nobody knows, actually. Nobody knows how the war will end. And right now, my scenario is, has been for quite some time, of course, that Russia is quite convenient in the war of attrition, and it went from long war to a longer war. Obviously now with the new revelations of engaging with other international partners. In our case, we've actually identified a strict three-dimensional approach right from the beginning here in the West, what we need to do. This three-dimensional approach was based and is still based on three components: sanctions, comprehensive military aid, in addition all other aid as well, whatever it takes approach, and then international isolation. Now, if you ask me to assess how are we doing with our three-dimensional approach as of today, I would say very openly, we are doing poorly. We are doing poorly. We are bypassing our own sanctions. There is a lot of data about that. We have introduced them, this was the success, and yet we are bypassing them via Russia's proxies. We promise Ukraine things that we do not deliver. We do not deliver on our own promises. And when it comes to international isolation, if you take a look at the world in 2024, Russia has partners, friends and clients all over the world. It's not just China and India, but even China and India will be enough to name.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Jonatan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that you can argue that it's unrealistic to expect to be able to push Russia back into Russia almost anywhere in Europe, but not in the Baltic states. Not here. Not here. I don't want to speak on the Latvians' behalf, I'll speak on the Estonians' behalf. The Estonian Foreign Ministry is in a building that used to be the Central Committee of the Estonian Communist Party. Okay? I'm sitting in the First Secretary's office. Tallinn was occupied until 1994. Until 1994, the Russians didn't want to withdraw. The city was occupied by the 144th Motorized Infantry Division, which in 1994 was commanded by Valery Gerasimov. He withdrew. We didn't fire a single shot at them, but he withdrew. Not because he decided to withdraw, but because they realized that the strategy they were pursuing was unsustainable. Now, the situation back then was different. The situation is always different. But to argue that it's not realistic to demonstrate clearly that in a long-term war of attrition with the international collective West, as they call us, that they have the upper hand? Who are you kidding? We have the upper hand. What we need to do is prove that we have staying power, that we can continue doing what we have been doing. And yes, the glass is half full and half empty, and I agree with all of the criticisms. The sanctions aren't as good as they should be. The political isolation of Russia could be better. Our support for Ukraine could be better. Our defense spending could be higher. I think we're moving in the right direction. But the main argument we need to defeat is the remaining cornerstone of Putin's theory of victory, which is this notion that time is somehow on his side. That is what we need to defeat. So we need to keep calm, carry on, as the Brits would say, keep doing what we have been doing, and we'll be able to push Russia back into its international borders. Absolutely realistic. We wouldn't be sitting here in Riga if it were unrealistic.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists. Absolutely riveting presentations from you all. Tom Withington, RUSI. I totally concur with the need to move towards having an umbrella, preferably a European one. My concern is that we're now facing a Europe where large minorities in our polities are perhaps sympathetic, if not outright supportive, to the global vision that people like Vladimir Putin have. And that risks retarding the development of this umbrella. How do we address that?
Mm-hmm. It will be my question to the panel.
I'm really sorry about asking.
Yeah.
No, it's a painful question, and these are very important questions. And again, it comes back to not just the risk assessment, but to political honesty. Now, I understand very well that our politicians, like when I say our politicians, I mean mostly here in Europe. I'm not in the position to talk about, American politics, that they didn't want to talk openly about what's going on in global geopolitics in order to not create additional panic. That was the understanding. At the beginning of the war, when we were going public and we were trying to explain what was happening, we were told by media not to talk about Russia, how Russia is waging a war against Europe. You see? But that is part of it. And now I wouldn't criticize, but I would say that politicians missed the opportunity to prepare the European population for the cognitive warfare that has been waged already back in the time prior to the first, Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Georgian invasion. That has never ceased. It's just that now the tools are more sophisticated. The instruments at disposal are, much better to operate with. And this is what's happening. If, we refer to the political honesty, let's say, this is the situation, this is happening, like it was during the Cold War. We had, the ideological competition, we had the cognitive warfare, we had the propaganda, and so on and so forth. And this must be done. So there are things that can be done.
Philippe?
30 seconds. First, you're head on in terms of the issue. Second, I'd say there's no silver bullet, but there are a series of tools that we have to get better at and that we have been getting better at, both at the national level in terms of what we are able to do within the EU, within NATO, within the G7, within ad hoc cooperations, in terms of fighting disinformation, of debunking false myths. Just in terms of what I know better in France, the government has now made the choice, the last couple of years, of being much more reactive in terms of identifying outside interference and disinformation, in particular Russian, but not exclusively, exposing it and countering it. Second, and there's no single answer to this, but I think there's nothing more effective than showing that democracy works. Otherwise, if you don't take the air out of the sails of the left-wing or the right-wing populisms that give the impression that short-term authoritarian answers are the ones that will bring satisfaction, then you're pouring water into the desert. And so that's the huge challenge for all of our governments, which goes far beyond the issues we're dealing with today.
Mm-hmm. No sane human being would ever allow a stranger to stick a knife in them unless they understood the wider context. If a doctor comes and tells you that you need to have an appendix removed, then you lie down, you allow a stranger to stick a knife in you. For that to happen, you need to understand what the stakes are. So it goes back to the points my colleagues made. Clarity of messaging when it comes to what is at stake. Secondly, you need to understand what the goal is. Clarity of messaging with regard to what is it that we're trying to achieve. And finally, clarity in terms of what our strategy is, how we're going to get to the goal. Now, there's a lot to be critical about when it comes to leadership, and this is all about leadership. These days, we haven't been as clear as, not all of us have been as clear as they should have been. But again, I believe things are getting slightly better. And again, I want to emphasize I have very high hopes for the new leadership team in Brussels.
And I wouldn't be myself, not allowing myself the Polish position into this debate. The answer in the Polish context is that security comes first, and it overplays or trumps the past narrative or past logic in our tremendous 30 years of peace and prosperity, where the liberals who used to run globalist agenda, I mean trade in Poland, are now saying security comes first. And that is an offer both for the problem that is external, but also the problem that is internal, because security focus brings also a certain order in the narrative and motivation in the general public. This is at least an honest attempt that has been working, speaking of the Cold War, throughout the West, where both partnership and power were balancing out, and they were on equal terms to one another. And probably this is what needs to happen.
Can I make one very small addendum to that, which is just to say that,
please,
if you put this in context as well, if you look at the US missile deployments to Europe in the 1980s, they were accompanied by mass protest, huge upheaval, huge division. You compare that to the announcement today that the US is sending long-range missiles to Germany from 2026, capable of striking deep into Russia. I mean, it's no comparison. Of course, there's some political controversy, but not on the same scale. And it's important to keep in, we've been here before, we've ridden out these waves of discontent before, but on the whole, we shouldn't exaggerate, I think, also the significance of the veto-wielding power of that fringe.
Thank you very much. I'll take two more questions, one by one. Please, gentlemen, there, and then we'll close the panel.
Thank you very much. Hiro Akita, Nikkei from Tokyo. So my question is a very short question about the plan B for US allies, not only for Europe, but also for Asia. So also in Japan, there is a lot of discussion about how to significantly increase the defense budget to reduce reliance on US. But all those discussion is about plan A or plan A dash. So difference is cheap riding or free riding. But my question is, let's assume we will not be able to rely on US security umbrella, hypothetically. And what could be the plan B option for Europe, which I don't have idea, but thank you.
Thank you very much. And also a mic goes to the back on the right. I think Ian Bond. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform in London. So I think this is probably a question for Philippe and Shashank. It's about defence budgets in the UK and France. I mean, these are two of the most important defence countries in Europe. UK going through a defence review at the moment. France, I think the president said at the beginning of the war that France would put its economy on a war footing. So the question is, First of all, is the French economy anything close to being on a war footing? And secondly, Shashank, what sense do you have of where the Strategic Defence Review in the UK is coming out? Is it going to do more than reaffirm 2% with an aspiration to 2.5%? Or is there actually going to be some serious new money on the table?
Thank you very much. Now we have really 30 seconds for each of those to be answered on a panel, and we'll continue later over coffee. War economy.
The short answer is no.
I see. Very, very quickly on Plan B. I think the problem is that all the Plan Bs only really play out on a timescale that is very long. In fact, the entire duration of a presidential term, if you think about producing officers that can staff a military headquarters, replacing US enablers, all of these other things, we all understand the timeline is very long. On Ian's question about UK defence budgets, I don't know where it'll land, but I think the important thing to remember is even if we get to 2.5% on a timeline to say we will spend 2.5% by 2030, which was the rather vague pledge of the previous government, that is running to stand still. That will just about keep us solvent on big projects like AUKUS, nuclear submarines, the new next sixth-generation fighter plane. It doesn't mean vast new divisions coming into Eastern Europe. It doesn't mean vast new capabilities. Russia, let's just pause and remember, is spending upwards of 7% of GDP on defense.
And if someone wants to use 5 seconds to say that there is a plan B?
Just 5 seconds, somewhere between 5 and 6% of GDP for defense spending.
In Europe.
In Europe.
And
thank you.
And the time problem, you know, a bit of luck that would buy us time.
And war economy. War economy is plan B in Central Eastern Europe and the Nordics, and building up the whole actually absent infrastructure, because over the last 30 years, all the infrastructure, transport, and everything else, you know, energy corridors, connectivity has been built, still has been built from east to west and vice versa. So this is actually the way forward to connect to the partners in the Indo-Pacific.
But all I want to say, one sentence, is that Plan B, that 5 to 6%, it's much more expensive and difficult if you were doing it after defeat in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Much more expensive and difficult than if you do it ahead of time.
Excellent panel. Thank you very much, both for your interventions and the questions from the floor.